Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Voices of CIVICA podcast series. Today we're recording at the London School of Economics with the Grimshaw podcast, and I'm your host, Belle. Today we're confronting one of Europe's most urgent yet least visible crises, the demographic time bomb that's already begun ticking. While we obsess over transitions that we see, such as climate change or AI and geopolitics, there's another transformation that's happening in plain sight. That is that Europe is getting old and relatively quickly. The working age population is projected to decline in 22 out of 27 of the EU countries between now and 2050. Europe is estimated to lose around 1 million workers each year until 2050, which is 42 million fewer people generating wealth, paying taxes, and supporting those who've retired. This has the potential to reshape European politics and economics as older voters prioritize pensions and healthcare over other policies such as education and infrastructure. To help us understand what this really means, we're joined today by Dr. Joan Costa-Font, Professor of Health Economics at the LSE, who specializes in the intersection of health and behavioral economics and political economy. Notably, he's a member of the WHO Technical Advisory Group on Economics for Environment, Climate Change, and Health, and has drafted the 2023 WHO Global Report on Long-Term Care Financing. Dr. Costa-Font, thank you so much today for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start perhaps by looking at the economic impact of aging populations, which most listeners may be most familiar with. First, how does aging populations affect a country's economic performance, especially in relation to debt?
Right, so one way to approach aging, population aging, and its economic effects is just to look at the immediate financial effects on the pension system, on the sustainability of health systems. And of course, that approach, some people take sort of what is called the scissor effect. So as more people retire, right, there's less individuals that can contribute to sustain the public finances of many welfare programs that are available in Europe. So then the solution to that is to delay retirement age, right? To make the system sustainable. In a way, you could think of it as those systems were created on the basis of a contract that today is expired, because the contract was based on population projections back in time, where individuals, the average life expectancy of most individuals in Europe would not exceed the age of 80, right? And right now, those projections have show very different results, which is a great thing. So that would be my second point. The first point is, one can take, let's say, a doom sort of perspective to it, but the positive effect is that we are aging better, we are aging healthier, right? So individuals that are at the retirement age of, let's say, 65, in many European countries are much healthier than they were 20, 30 years ago. So the welfare loss from working a bit further beyond the usual retirement age is actually much smaller, right? And we know that these days there is digital technology available, artificial intelligence, which means that even if we lose some workers along the way, we can actually make up for that through artificial intelligence. Older individuals are increasingly bringing more experience into their jobs. Teams that are diverse, age-wise, tend to be more creative. And on top of that, we know that innovation doesn't only happen early in life. I mean, there's plenty of entrepreneurs that have had their ideas in their 60s and 70s. So I would say population aging is not a disaster, is not doomsday, right? If anything, is the opposite. It shows that as a society we are succeeding, that people are getting older with much better health, and that better health allows them to work until later, and we know that actually healthy aging already increases about half a percentage point annually in the global GDP of many European economies. So it's actually positive news. So I think that we should reframe the debate on aging into being a debate around success as opposed to financial sustainability. No?
So is investment into long-term care potentially a way to boost progress then in seemingly plateauing European economies?
Right, so long-term care is what happens when individuals are not in good health, right? And they need the support from someone else. So I guess that you could argue that the best long-term care is the one that is not needed, right? So ideally what we would want as a European society is to have very few people that need long-term care. And the way to do that is investing earlier in life, right? So many programs, many health programs, and you could even argue, programs that boost, say, individuals' capabilities early in life have consequences on the probability of individuals being disabled and in need of long-term care later in life. So that basically means that ideally we should invest on that in order to need less long-term care. Now, having said that, it's true that European populations are aging. Almost, I think, only Ireland is, as far as I remember, is the only country where the median age is below 40, but just literally marginally, I think it's 39.7, but literally almost all the other European countries, the median age exceeds 40, and in the case of Italy, it's almost 50. So the individual that cuts the distribution into, the demographic distribution into in Italy is already at the age of 50, right? So, this means that, we really need to desperately invest in the health of those populations, because if we don't, then that would show up in 20 years' time with a significant increase in the demand for long-term care. Now, the problem with long-term care is that it's a service, is a type of care that was traditionally provided by the family. It was not part of the traditional welfare state contracts, right? It's in many European countries they call it the fourth pillar, right? Because it was not there initially. It was not part of the three pillars, right? The fact that many countries have not invested in long-term care is making their health systems quite inefficient, because individuals are blocking beds in hospitals, some individuals are being caregivers for people that are in need of care that potentially could be in the labor market, right? And this is actually creating inefficiencies to the other welfare programs, to the welfare state. So the welfare state is not being efficient enough because it didn't plan back in time the need of providing long-term care to older populations. And in a way, the individuals that are facing most of that cost, that burden, are primarily women, because the traditional caregiver is middle-aged women, right? Women between 45 to 65. It's true that we are seeing more men now raising up as caregivers, but still, there is a significant gender component, and as I was saying, is making other welfare programs, particularly health programs, quite inefficient, right? Because many caregivers are not caregivers by choice, so are just caregivers by default. So your mom needs care, there's nobody available to provide care. In Britain, for instance, if you only receive public support from the council if your wealth is below £23,000. But because most families have a wealth that exceeds that amount, that means that they are on their own, basically. And that's the case in the US, for instance. Medicaid only provides care once individuals' wealth is below a certain very low threshold, right? And even in countries where there is some level of long-term care insurance, long-term care insurance only pays for a relatively small proportion of the care needed. So individuals still have to save to pay for care. So this is really, I would say, one of those welfare programs that we don't have a very clear solution yet. And that's why it excites me so much to try to contribute to it.
So, given this large cost of long-term care programs, have you seen any strategies that states have adopted to mitigate this burden of long-term care? And is there any way in your research that we can create cost-effective social care programs?
Right. So my research has shown that, or is showing actually progressively, that actually investing in long-term care is potentially efficient. We estimate what's called the cost effectiveness of long-term care programs. So the reason why I mention cost effectiveness is that because when it comes to healthcare, we tend to evaluate treatments or programs, health programs, based on how cost effective they are. And normally the National Health Service in Britain decides that if a program is below a certain level of cost by level of effectiveness, cost per quality, which is our measure of effectiveness, then that program gets reimbursed by the NHS, and if it's too costly by level of effectiveness, then it doesn't get reimbursed, right? So what we show is that actually most long-term care programs are cost effective. So are as cost effective as many healthcare programs. The problem is that long-term care is not part of the health system, it's not part of the NHS. So perhaps what the research seems to be showing is that it's about time to integrate long-term care into the health system, right? Because if we don't, then the consequence of that is that the burden falls into families, right, and local authorities that are not very well funded. So Britain these days is only increasing council taxes, and we have actually local authorities that are really in financial hardship, facing hardship, primarily because they are funding social care, which is a responsibility that should not have been devolved down to the local authorities. It should be a responsibility that you could argue that the central government should take over. Now, there are ways to make long-term care more cost-effective. One is basically moving away from nursing homes. I mean, during COVID-19, a significant share of the population died in nursing homes because it wasn't really efficiently managed. I mean, in many European countries, like for instance in the region of Madrid in Spain, there were clinical guidelines that were discouraging older people to even go to hospital, right? So they died in nursing home, in part due to the negligence of the government. So these days we know that actually moving away from nursing homes and investing more in home help, home care, deinstitutionalizing the system is actually the way to make it more sustainable. At the same time, I would argue we should actually try to centralize a bit more the funding of long-term care, which is now in many countries down on local authorities up to the, let's say, central level. And finally, there is a lot of promising initiatives when it comes to digital, right? So these days one could do easily remote monitoring, right, of older people at home, which allows to check how well they are doing. There's different initiatives that they combine caregiver visits with digital monitoring, and that can significantly make the process of taking care of people that are not in very severe needs of care more cost effective.
Has there been general public support for this integration, centralization of long-term care into like the healthcare sector?
Well, I think that most people don't know about it.
Yeah.
That's the problem. I mean, all these details about how the health system is funded, how social care is funded, is not known only today. I heard in the Today program in the radio, people were defining what social care in Britain. They call it social care. So what social care means, because many people assume that this type of service is already covered, is part of the welfare state, and is covered by the NHS, and it's not. Right? And it's not until you need the social care yourself, because your grandparents or your parents are in need of care, that you realize that actually this is not part of the contract, and that somebody has to do something about it, but it's already too late. Britain, we have had 26 years now of royal commissions, failed royal commissions, trying to solve the problem of social care, they call it. And every royal commission has come up with a solution that the government has ignored, and no matter the political spin of the government, right? I've heard that there is a new one, and it's great, but just running commissions is not helpful, right? So they should find a solution. As of now, there's been like 3 reforms in Europe that I would highlight. One is the Scottish reform. So Scotland, when they got government responsibilities back in 2001. The first thing they did was they implemented the recommendations of the Royal Commission, the first Royal Commission that Britain had, right? And then Spain, a year before the financial crisis, they implemented a long-term care reform that very much mimics the German model. And then Slovenia very recently has implemented long-term care reform. So there is a system of public funding of long-term care. So those will be the 3 main reforms. in addition to the ones that were implemented in the 90s, which would be the German reform, which extends the social security system, the social insurance system to cover for long-term care, and then the Dutch reform, which happened in the late 60s, which is very much still in place and now being reformed again.
We've discussed quite a lot about the economic effects of economic implications and potential burdens of long-term care and aging populations, and now I want to move on to the political impacts of aging populations, which can often be overlooked in these discussions. First of all, what are the main sort of political implications of aging populations, especially considering that there's generational wealth inequality?
Right. So I mean, you basically mentioned that the key issue is like inequality. No? I mean, there is very significant intergenerational inequality in many Western countries. So baby boomers have benefited from housing asset risings, and they have had easy access to housing. They benefited from that, and unfortunately, younger generations are facing heavy constraints in having access to the housing market. Right. So that kind of creates some level of tension, and you can see that reflected in support for different parties. So the Green Party is mainly supported by the younger cohorts, whilst the Reform and Conservative parties are supported by baby boomers, the older cohorts. So, and that is very much the same in many European countries, right? So there is a big divide around age, which right now is sort of managed, but actually could become a bit nasty, and you could even argue that what we are seeing is because the populations are aging. That means that the electorate, the median voter, if you like, is aging across European countries. So I mentioned Italy, for instance. The median individual, so the median voter, is around 50, right? So that basically means that programs that tend to benefit individuals of older age, like pensions, healthcare, and presumably long-term care, although we don't see much of that yet, would take more and more importance in detriment of education and even public infrastructure. So what we are seeing is that there is less and less investment in public infrastructure and education, which are basically investments in the long term, right? Whilst we are seeing a lot more investment in, let's say, pensions and programs that typically benefit older populations, right? Now, one of the issues there around politics is to do with the fact that often the responsibilities for certain programs, like we mentioned long-term care before, are allocated at the wrong level of government. So there needs to be something done around that. And I would say that the intergenerational inequality, the fact that the needs of the population are so different across cohorts, and the older populations actually make a larger share of the entire country, can be concerning, because one could potentially win an election completely ignoring younger people, right? And that is to a certain extent concerning, because we might be jumping into gerontocracies, into systems where we are already seeing that many prime ministers and presidents across the world, starting by President Trump, but Modi in India, or the Secretary General of the Communist Party in China. The most important countries in the world have presidents that are very close or even above 80 years of age, which is concerning, but very much in line with the fact that populations are aging, and even when those populations are democracies and exert their right to vote, they tend to vote for older candidates who are regarded as having the experience, right? So perhaps one of the problems is that in politics experience is overrated.
You mentioned the potential for younger people and younger interests to be disenfranchised and underrepresented, given the possibility for gerontocracies. Mm-hmm. Then has there been any resistance or pushback against older people occupying political office?
Not yet. I haven't seen any of that yet. If anything, you see the opposite. You see revolts, like in France, against changes in retirement age, right? Because most of young people are too busy actually at work or taking care of their children. So they don't have time. The period of your life that individuals, anyone really, is busier is around one's 30s. No? I mean, in your 30s you have still a career to push, and at the same time you have children to take care, if you have children, right? And that basically limits the capacity to exert political action. Now, whether we like it or not, what we are seeing again is like certain changes in many countries, like for instance changes to not only to extend the employment age, right, but even the re-ablement of older employees that had been retired. So what we're seeing is that many health systems across Europe are re-employing retired doctors because they have shortages, right? So the only way to deal with short-term shortages is to basically calling back those individuals that already went on retirement, right? So in Europe, about 30% of around 2060, 30% of the population will be will be old age, will be over 65, which basically means that one of the ideas is, rather than just forcing everyone to retire later, is to financially incentivize people to stay on employment, which is a much more, let's say, positive way of doing that. But what we are seeing as well is the return of the family. So younger cohorts, in some respects, tend to be more conservative. I mean, there seems to be a bit of a rebound of familiarism, and that makes sense because if the wealth is in the hands of older populations, young children would not be able to actually be independent by themselves. So often what you see is that they depend on the care that grandparents provide to their children, or on financial support from family, either in the form of transfers or co-housing. I mean, we are seeing in many countries several generations living together, right? So there's been like very significant societal transformations because of aging that perhaps were not expected some years ago.
You mentioned just now the protests in France quite frequent protests in France over pension policies. So then, is the burden of aging populations a source of anger across the European working population? And to follow up from that, do you think that young people are the ones who lose out the most from aging populations, whereas older populations, they do see increasing improvements in things like long-term care and social care?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't place it in terms of like, there is a clear intergenerational conflict, but I think that the conflict in itself is not the way to go, because the younger generations can actually benefit a lot from the experience. Although I said that experience is overrated, but it's true that they can actually benefit from older populations. So I think that the challenge these days in organizations is creating teams that are diverse in terms of age, because if having older populations in your team enhances learning, right, that will basically be a way of making sure that teams are effective, right? We know that there are shortages. I mentioned doctors before, but shortages exist across countries because it's very hard to predict what kind of profession one should invest on, and it's very difficult to advise on that because the labor market is very dynamic. So I would say the solution is not to enhance the tension between generations, but try to find ways to encourage cooperation. I'm not saying that's easy, but clearly that seems the way to go. I mean, the cooperation is happening within families, right? So some parents are more generous than others. I know that in Southern Europe, for instance, many parents are burdened, many grandparents are burdened by having to provide care to their grandchildren, right? So there is actually an expected duty of care towards the grandchildren, right? And there is a bit of a pushback now from that generation. I guess that the cooperation is happening at the family level, but I think that should be extended across society.
You've also mentioned a few times that there are labor shortages
Yes.
in the in European economies. So ideally, to compensate for this aging labor force and decreasing working population, nations tend to require injections of labor from abroad. And we see this quite frequently in East and Southeast Asia. Yet many European politicians now are simultaneously pushing back against immigration. So how is this tension between economic need and populist political narratives harmful for economic progress and, as you said, cooperation, and potentially more broadly, democracy in Europe as a whole?
Yeah, so democracy requires cooperation across groups. But I mean, we know that because it's so difficult to predict how the economy will evolve over time, shocks like, for instance, Brexit, they brought significant shortages. For instance, the NHS these days is having significant shortage of healthcare personnel because of Brexit, right? But I would say, generally speaking, there is a shortage of doctors and nurses across Europe. And the only solution to that, at least in the short term, because it takes so many years to train a doctor and a nurse, is actually to encourage migration, to basically import doctors from other countries, right? Which has consequences then on the countries of origin, which should not be neglected, right? But clearly, I mean, this is a need, and this is the only way to keep, the pension system running, so that because those migrants help then sustain the pension system, they help actually sustain the health system, right? And then when those public services work, then individuals tend to support democracy, because democracy is a contract where individuals vote and pay taxes in exchange of some welfare services and protection, right? So when social protection is not delivered or is delivered at very low quality because there are shortages, then that erodes democracy, right? And these days what we are seeing is that the strategy of the extreme right is precisely help eroding democracy, introducing austerity, lowering the quality of public services, and acting precisely on what could have strengthened the public service, which is migration, right? So if we get migrants that help sustain those public services, then those public services will survive, and democracy as a result will be strengthened. But precisely that's not what the extreme right wants. I mean, what they want is the opposite. They want to weaken our democracy although they claim the opposite, precisely what they want is to weaken the entry of migrants, which would help sustain those welfare services. And on top of that, they tend to constantly, at least that's what I've seen in many European countries, in Britain, in Spain. I mean, the extreme right is constantly questioning the viability of the NHS, the viability of public services, and trying to convince people to go private, right? As if that was the solution, when we all know that private healthcare cannot deliver what the NHS can, right? So if an individual has cancer stage 4, they should never go to a private clinic because they will die for sure, whilst they have a chance perhaps in the NHS. Right, so the individuals that have serious healthcare need will not get the care that they need in the private sector. Right, so private healthcare should exist to complement the NHS, but should not be the primary form of care, of health insurance at least, because it cannot deliver on what the NHS does. On top of that, what we are seeing in many European countries is lots of uncertainty, and I would say the extreme right is clinging a lot on identity narratives. They want people to believe that the past can be revived, right? When the past is gone, right? But still, I mean, you tell people that something that they remember that was great can return if we kick out all the migrants, right? And they might just support it, not so much because they want to get rid of migrants, is just because they want that dream, right? And that dream is not true. So I think that one of the key issues that we are facing today is how to deal with misinformation. There's very little fact-checking in politics. It's very easy to come up with some narrative that is completely untrue and impossible, right? And that narrative could easily sway the population to vote one way, and only a few decades later, like for instance happened with Brexit, they will discover that was not true, but it's already too late, right? And because it's a narrative based on identity, many people don't want to hold to the truth because that would mean questioning their identity, and that's quite troubling.
How can we potentially restore faith in the social contract despite this polarization and growing identity politics?
Well, one way to go is basically counteracting this misinformation, right? So and counteracting it on spot, right? So not allowing certain narratives to have a sway in society, right? So being quite serious in fact checking, everything that goes down into the public debate. But that's just on the narrative. I mean, one of the, I would say, most important policy questions, at least in Europe, is to understand how narratives are formed, right? And how to counteract them. No? So because narratives end up affecting people's preferences, and preferences affect how people vote, right? So the question is how to counteract those narratives, and I don't have like a magic answer to that. All I would say is that I think that they should be counteracted on spot. We shouldn't allow certain narratives. These days, people don't even read anything. I mean, you see older people sharing TikToks. I mean, younger and older, but older people too. Sharing TikToks that are completely made up, and most people are unable to tell whether what they are seeing is true or not, sadly. And that's what's concerning, that somebody has created a big brother, most people are unable to recognize what is true and what is not. It's creating tensions even within families. So you see older people, develop ideas that are based on TikTok videos that have nothing to do with reality, and that kind of creates tension with younger generations.
So finally, to conclude and try to bring everything that we've discussed together, well, first of all, what do you think the future of European aging population policy is going to look like? And also, is there any other countries, potentially in Asia, where there are also similar aging population issues that European nations can look towards as an example?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that Europe should do is counteract all these narratives of ageism. No? I mean, this idea that the ideal age to have is just mid-20s, and any other age is a disaster. I mean, like that should not be the case, right? Because then people would be frustrated. We should change as well what our standards of beauty are. So we should not see aging as a disaster. Aging is something that we cannot do anything about. It's just gonna happen. All we can expect is to age well, to age healthily, right? And happily, right? And I think that if we do that, if we focus on healthy aging, right, that will automatically have spillover effects on the health system, because there will be less demand on healthcare services. People will be able to work longer, and as a result, put the pension system on less strain, and altogether will make societies happier. Basically, that will be my recipe. In terms of countries, I would agree that Europe is aging very, very rapidly, but there are countries in Asia that are already experiencing aging even more rapidly than Europe, like Japan, for instance, or Korea, or Singapore. And those countries, they are doing what we all expect Europe to do, which is expanding retirement age. So the idea is to promote senior employment. There is a lot of talk around the silver economy. I mean, these days, about 60% of most countries' wealth is in the hands of the older people. Like the vast majority of wealth is in the hands of older people. So that means that there is a potential for business developing around older people. It's what we call the silver economy. That is a source of employment as well, and it can be a source of employment as well for older people, not just for younger people, right? And then there's a lot of investment happening in automation, in digital health, but as well in digital technologies, right? That will only make the well-being of older people better. It's going to improve the well-being of older people. Right? These days, many of the duties that in the past would be really tough for older people can be done through apps and digital technologies, robots, right? And that might mean that many people can live independently until quite later in life without any need of support. So I think that that's one of the lessons from Asian countries, that we need to invest more on digital. And then another important aspect that we should have a bit of a thought about is on housing policy, right? Singapore is an interesting example where they've actually invested on housing at the outskirts of the country, or the city. It's a city country, in order to liberate housing in the center of the city for individuals that are unemployment. So the idea is that older people are incentivized to move into assisted living in the outskirts of the city, and typically individuals that are in employment age tend to live more in central locations, right? So housing policy will be one of the top issues to be discussed, and there's still very little debate. I'm surprised that not more people are interested in the intersection of housing and aging.
I think community as well is another important aspect to build when thinking about aging populations.
Absolutely. I mean, healthy aging, one of the variables that we know that improves healthy aging is social networks, so community, right? So having social interactions, not just within the family, but actually in the wider society. So, casual interactions in a park, that would potentially boost the emotional well-being of older people. And we know that actually the interaction between different generations is something that tends to benefit everyone, not just the older people.
Relatedly then, because certain regions are more like community social based, whereas a lot of like people in like America are more like individualistic. Do you think this could be like harmful then?
Yeah, I think that Asia is a bit different than Europe on that front, that there is less ageism. So people that are old age tend to be more respected. Perhaps there's still this idea that that they should deserve respect and so forth. Whilst we don't see that much in Europe, right? So there is even when it comes to language, right? So there is quite a lot of disrespect towards older populations, and that's something to counteract, because in societies that are ageist, then aging is a disaster. Aging is in itself equated to lowering standards of living, lowering well-being, lowering health, right? Which is not really how things should be, right? So that's just the wrong narrative. We should change that narrative. And there's already lots of people working on this, so I'm just like announcing what other people are doing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Costa-Font, for coming on to the podcast today, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.